I'm happy to welcome you all here to this special joint Mahindra Humanities Center seminar in Celtic literature and culture and in medieval studies. Today we'll be hearing from Brent Miles, who is a professor of medieval Celtic languages and literatures at the University of Toronto in the Center for Medieval Studies and St. Michael's College. Professor Miles's research focuses principally on medieval literature in Irish and Welsh, although he also has a strong interest in Hiberno and Anglo-Latin literature from Ireland and Wales. He has published widely on classical poetry and mythology in medieval Ireland and the relationship of classical learning to the native corpus of heroic narrative in Irish. In addition to multiple articles on these subjects, he has also published a highly regarded monograph with Boydell and Brewer in 2011 titled Heroic Saga and Classical Epic in Medieval Ireland, which is, I think, really now the first place for anyone interested in classical learning in Ireland to begin their research. Since that landmark publication, he has not rested on his laurels. Just last year, his edition and translation of Duntrace Troy on the Third Troy was published as Irish Texts Society, volume 68. And I'm sure despite pandemic shipping delays, some of us have already gotten our greedy little hands on that and seen the great work that he has done there. He has also devoted considerable attention in recent years to the list of kingship in Irish and Hiberno Latin. And I believe we'll get a chance to hear how his work on that area is going today in the talk. So the talk today is titled The Just and Unjust King, Treatises on Biblical Kingship from Medieval Ireland. And I will turn it over to Brent Miles now. So thank you very much for joining us, Brent.
Thank you very much, Natasha. Can I confirm that I can be heard right now?
Yes.
Yes. Also, can I confirm, my screen may look different from other people's screen. Can people see my face right now, or is it only the ugly mug of Brian Baru that people can actually see?
We can see both.
That's okay. That's unfortunate. I'll just remember that. Thank you. Okay. To begin, I would like to thank Harvard University and the Department of Celtic Languages and Literatures for inviting me to speak in their seminar series this afternoon. This talk is co-sponsored by the Seminar on Medieval Studies and the Mahindra Humanities Center at Harvard University. Many thanks to them as well. I am delighted to be part of your events for the close of this extraordinary term. And now, when I corresponded with Natasha about speaking, I had in mind initially a more casual seminar format with the intention of presenting work in progress, something more like an editor's workshop than a talk. Upon reflection, for the sake of a smooth seminar, I decided to read from a prepared script instead with a PowerPoint, which I guess people can see. This is also the first time I'm reading from a script while sitting in front of a computer, so bear with me, we'll see how it works. This is why I was wondering if people can see my face, because that means I have to be careful not to make faces, because I didn't know anyone would be able to see me. Now, all the same, I am presenting a work in progress. So I am happy to pause throughout if anyone would like to discuss any matter that comes up, and certainly invite comments. I invite comments at the end. The subject of this seminar is a project that is currently on my desk, an editorial project focused on a series of texts from medieval Ireland which concern biblically derived theories of kingship. I treat this series of related texts as a continuum, and I will introduce the texts in question in a moment. Now, this talk is in part a progress report on this editorial project. However, I'm reminded of some of my first readers' reports from early attempts at academic publishing, now a while ago, and I recall the question asked of me when discussing study of medieval texts that have not yet been printed in modern editions, and so generally are unfamiliar. The question was, why should readers care? I will do my best to argue for the scholarly and cultural interest of this editing project, and I take a pleasure in introducing material that will be new to some. The underlying material and themes, however, will be abundantly familiar, even in the guise of an editorial work in progress. Let's see, there we are. And in that spirit of the familiar unknown, I would like to start with this passage, which opens the text and introduces my theme. There was once an illustrious king over the children of Israel, Solomon, son of David. That was the Solomon who was wisest of the men of the world, apart from the Savior, Jesus Christ. And so opens the text called in the manuscripts, the Tagisk Rigla Solov Vikaviv, the royal teaching of Solomon, son of David. For short, throughout this talk, I will be calling this text simply the Tagisk, or the teaching. When I started working on the Tagisk a few years back, I could not find in my literature review that anyone had ever written about it apart from manuscript catalogs. And even there, I found it mistitled in at least one instance. But though probably not familiar in its details, the themes and format in this opening are abundantly familiar to readers of Middle Irish, and they set up certain expectations. But the title itself would set up informed readers for a false expectation. I mean, of course, the word tagisk, Irish for instruction or teaching, which to readers of Middle Irish comes with a set of expectations. The medieval genre of the tagisk, or tegusk, depending on your pronunciation, is well known, and the principal texts, which I list here on this slide, are well studied in the secondary literature. The tegusk is an instruction for a prince or king, a native equivalent to the speculum principis of European tradition. The genre is widely accepted as one of the oldest in the native literature, and one of the most socially conservative, in line with the fact that kingship is itself a conservative institution in the Celtic nations. The instruction I am discussing today happens to depart from this model. It is of a wholly different type of text, and it outlines a theory of kingship which may or may not be influenced by conservative Irish models, but on the face of it is wholly biblical in origin and presented as wise kingly teachings of the great Israelite King Solomon. The Tagisk takes as its departure an episode from the life of Solomon culled from 1 Kings 3. I'm translating from the Irish here. Quote, "It was that Solomon, furthermore, who sacrificed at one time an entire holocaust to the Lord on the renowned altar in Gabaon. And it was to him that the Lord appeared in a dream. And thus he said to him, O king, request now everything that you wish in reward for your sacrifice, that I may give it to you. Thus responded Solomon, give me therefore an understanding and wise heart, that I may give true judgments on your household and on your people, and that there might come to me the ability to distinguish between evil and good." I print some words in bold with their Irish original at the top of the slide to note the themes that will dominate this treatise on kingship, namely the understanding heart, which comes directly from 1 Kings, and the true judgments, which are an Irish addition to the episode and represent in brief, maybe the key feature underpinning native Irish notions of kingship. Here, Israelite kingship receives a Celtic correction. Despite this addition, the text is overwhelmingly orthodox biblical in character, notable in the continuation of this passage, where the Lord responds to Solomon, O king, because it is the request that you have made of the Lord, he will give you an abundance of wisdom and knowledge. And you will be given, moreover, even that which you did not ask for me, namely riches and worldly glory, so that there has not been before you, and there will not be after you from the kings of the world one like you. The words in italics reproduce the original Latin, not original Latin, but the Latin, literally, and so the biblical character of the Lord's reward to Solomon is preserved. Old Testament kingship is surprisingly worldly. This worldliness sits well in Tagisk, and it will be the principal idea of this presentation. Now, getting back to the matter of the edition, I have found the Tagisk so far in 4 manuscripts. I reiterate that this is a work in progress, and that I am still collecting and collating manuscript witnesses, though I think I have them all by now. Though understudied, the text has been in front of modern readers' eyes for quite a while. Now I'll go through just some of the manuscripts. The first copy comes to us in the composite manuscript known as the Yellow Book of Lecan, where it occupies 4 1/3 columns, coming in at around 2,500 words. So the text is not long, and has been before the eyes of readers at least since the 19th century facsimile prepared by Robert Atkinson of the Yellow Book of Lecan. This image comes from the digital facsimile on ISOS, Irish Script on Screen, which of course has made all these texts much more available. and which I give here with gratitude, as it has made the experience of reading Irish manuscripts much easier and enjoyable than it used to be. Now, the second copy is a Cephalus in a manuscript written by William Macanlega, the famed 15th century scribe and author, whose work has been reasonably well studied. His copy of the Tagus happens to be incomplete, but otherwise it seems to reproduce an earlier Middle Welsh text of the Tagus faithfully. This image is taken from the website Gallica. Now, the third copy is Edinburgh manuscript 711, a Scottish manuscript copied by Dúil Alpnach mac Vic Habel in 1467, by all appearances from Irish exemplars. And I practiced all week trying to pronounce that name in proper Gaelic, and I just messed it up. It was inevitable. At any rate, this is the famed manuscript that happens to preserve the Highland genealogies, one of Scotland's cultural treasures. As I happen to have a bias in favor of old things Scottish these days, I regret to pass on that the manuscript also happens to be a nuisance to read. You can see why. The ink is faded to the point of being infuriating, and it is not the handsomest product of the Gaelic world. For the purposes of my edition, moreover, this manuscript's text of the Tagus also happens to break off about 2/3 from the end, and so is of limited value. Now, the final manuscript is another Edinburgh manuscript. It happens to be a very handsome work and has what one could call the best reader's text of the Tagus, being both complete and linguistically very clean. That is to say, easy to understand with little obvious corruption or obscure language. Now, Aisteen Tanish at the Fachclad na Gaelic project in Edinburgh has kindly passed on to me Ronald Black's most recent estimation of the origin of this manuscript. In spite of its current home in Edinburgh, it is not Scottish, but just as it looks, it is almost certainly Irish. This is a personal disappointment to me, as I'm on a Scottish kick these days, but of course it is of no relevance for the edition. The text in the 4 manuscripts shows features typical of Irish textual tradition, meaning that the wording varies slightly in each, actually quite a bit in each, and I have given up attempting to construct a stemma along linguistic grounds. But in terms of content, the text is very much the same in each copy, apart from the fact that 2 are incomplete. For my edition, I intend to reproduce the text from this last manuscript, Edinburgh 7217, as a Codex Optimus, and it is this text that I quote throughout this talk. Now, the subtitle of this talk is Treatises on Biblical Kingship from Medieval Ireland. The emphasis here is on treatises in the plural. The Tagus Iriga, is in fact only one stage in a continuum of rewriting and adaptation of closely related sets of texts whose composition spans roughly 1,000 years. My current project is to edit not just the Tagus, number 3 on this list, but also the 2nd and 4th texts in this sequence. For the purpose of this talk, I will go through these texts quickly, first and then just to lay out the rationale for the project. Now, the earliest text in this tradition is the Rex Iniquus, or the Unjust King. The Rex Iniquus is an Irish composition, conventionally dated to the 8th century. The text is not long. It is in fact a chapter in a larger work, which I will detail in a moment. Among other things, the text gives a description of the features of poor kingship, as the title suggests, but it continues to delineate the features of good kingship and the duties of a king. The takeaway is that it was written in Latin, a clear product of the Irish monastic schools of the period. In maybe the 11th century, the Rex Iniquus was incorporated into a longer tract on kingship, the Sermo ad Reges, a sermon to kings, number 2 on this slide. In a publication from a while back, I chose to describe the Sermo, Sermo ad Reges, as a commentary on the Rex Iniquus, rather than a sermon in the sense of a preached text. The Sermo quotes the Rex Iniquus in full, but adds to it a wealth of additional material drawn mostly from the Bible. Because of the biblical learning displayed throughout, I have chosen to term the kingship described in the Sermo biblical kingship, and I have decided to read it as a text in this continuum of Irish biblical commentary tradition. As I already said, the Sermo includes a complete quotation of the Rex Iniquus in the original Latin, but also other passages in Latin, and it is reasonable to describe it as macaronic or bilingual. The relationship between the Tagus text 3 here, on the slide, and the Sermo is at the heart of this talk today. Simply put, I regard the Tagus as a rewriting of the Sermo. This is nowhere made explicit in the text, but I infer this relationship from the content and style of the Tagisk, which is credibly an abbreviation of an earlier text of a palpably later linguistic expression. The Tagisk is about a third of the length of the Sermo, and notably, it abandons the bilingual format and either removes all the Latin or translates it further into Middle Irish. Now, I do not have much to say about the last text here, number 4, the Tagisk Rich Sullivan. I have found the text so far in 2 18th century manuscripts, both in the Royal Irish Academy. The first is the Book of Knockanini of 1718, compiled for the Fermanagh patron, Brent McCoy, and the second, a manuscript of 1746. What I have determined so far is that, in spite of the title, the Tagisk Rich, number 4, is not a copy of the Tagisk Riga, which precedes it on this slide. Instead, it seems to be a modern version of the earlier Sermo ad Reges. My transcription of the text is incomplete. One of my projects intended for last summer was to transcribe from the manuscripts in the Academy. Alas, that was not to be. Accordingly, my initial impressions are from a rough transcription of the early parts from 2 fairly poor microfilms. So far, it seems that the text has been copied without the Latin and with a surprisingly faithful copying of the language of the earlier text. I note this modern text here principally because with this late date, it nicely caps what could be described as roughly 1,000 years of interest in this sequence of Irish treatises on kingship. I find this a nice round number, and so I like it. However, I don't want to stray too far into the thickets of determining when a text is a living tradition and when it becomes antiquarian and what that distinction might mean. This would be a fine discussion for another time, and maybe we can take it up in the question period at the end of this talk. Now, the second manuscript in this last number 4 was described by Eugene O'Curry in the 19th century, which is not of any great moment in itself, but it does bring the text up to the dawn of our era. All the texts here, in fact, bring their own evidence of readership throughout the centuries. The copy of the Tagisk from the Yellow Book of Lecan is in a section of the manuscript that was glossed by the 18th century historian Charles O'Connor, and I suspect marks to aid reading throughout the Tagisk are his. The version from the second Edinburgh manuscript, National Library of Scotland 711, was transcribed by the Reverend John Beaton for the Welsh linguist Edward Llwyd, while the version in the first Edinburgh manuscript shows multiple correcting hands, as does the text of the Sermo in the Lower Brack. I take these evidences of readership as confirmation that this series of texts had an importance in the Irish tradition belied by the text's comparative obscurity today. I will now go through these texts in a little more detail. My comments on the first text can be brief. The Rex Iniquus is a short tract. It is the 9th chapter from a longer work, the anonymous De Duodecim Abusivis Seculi, the 12 Abuses of the World. The 12 Abuses of the World is a tract on moral failings in society, and the title is a fair description of the work. The Rex Iniquus is the 9th abuse described. It is almost certainly the product of an early Irish monastery dated to the second half of the 7th century, most recently and most definitively by Aidan Breen. The text has been available since 1909 in a critical edition by Zygmunt Helleman and was re-edited in an unpublished PhD dissertation in 1988 by Breen. Familiar to modern readers in Helleman's edition, the text is a bit of a classic in the Hiberno Latin field. The Rex Iniquus is simple in style. I can illustrate it with this extract. At the beginning of the piece, the author tells us that a king must observe, above all, justice. Now here's the Latin. I will read the English translation. Quote, "For it is in the king's justice that his throne is exalted, and in truth that the government of his people is established. A king's justice is, to oppress no one unjustly, to judge between one man and the next without regard for status, to be a defender of foreigners and orphans and widows, and so forth." The Rex Iniquus follows the simple list format throughout. The effect is like a litany. The duties of a just king are followed by a description of the unjust king, which is the model to be avoided. It is from this foundational text that I took the title to this talk, The Just and Unjust King. The chapter concludes with a description of disasters which befall a kingdom when the king is unjust, followed by a description of the effect of a just king, namely a happy people and a prosperous kingdom. Quote, "Behold how greatly the king's justice benefits the world. It is the peace of the people, the country's protection, the people's fortification, the nation's defense, the cure for ailments, men's joy, air's mildness, sea's calmness, the earth's fruitfulness," and so forth. The Rex Iniquus is unquestionably a work from the golden age of Irish monasticism. It has been demonstrated that this chapter on kings, once taken to the continent by Irish monks, served as the basis for the emerging genre of Carolingian specula principum, or mirrors for princes. The genre is normative Christian. The benefits of a just king described in the Rex Iniquus, however, seem supernatural in a vaguely non-orthodox way. The monastic authors certainly knew the Bible, and the Old Testament is rich in royal ideology, but this text is not overtly biblical. For this view of a king's justice expressed here and its supernatural benefits for his kingdom, most critics think that they detect a specifically native Irish ideology. No, a native ideology of kingship is well preserved for us in a number of vernacular texts from the period, the genre I described a few minutes ago, the native Irish teagasc, or mirror for princes. This literature has been well studied in the modern period and will be familiar to most attending this talk. The earliest surviving native mirror is the text Oedach Morin, the Testament of Morin. Morin is a teacher to a young Irish prince. This is explicitly instruction to a prince. The overriding theme of the instruction is something called Fir Fladalon, a term translated by the modern editor Fergus Kelly as the justice of the ruler. Quote, I'll read the English. It is through the justice of the ruler that he secures peace, tranquility, joy, ease, and comfort. The theme is developed in great length in the text. For example, quote, it is through the justice of the ruler that plagues and great lightnings are kept from the people. It is through the justice of the ruler that he dispatches great battalions to the borders of hostile neighbors. It is through the justice of the ruler that abundances of great tree fruit of the great wood are tasted. It is through the justice of the ruler that milk yields of great cattle are maintained, and so forth. This ideology of the legitimacy given kingly rule by justice, and justice above all else, is familiar to readers of the large literature in Irish about kings. Being apparently central to the Rex Iniquus, it is no surprise that the king's justice features in turn in the Sermo ad Reges. The Sermo has been familiar to modern readers since Robert Atkinson's Passions and Homilies from the Lower Brack, published in 1887. The Lower Brack, or Dublin Royal Irish Academy manuscript 1230, is the only medieval copy I know. In that manuscript, the Sermo comes as one of a series of 9 bilingual Latin Middle Irish homilies, and the collection was believed by Frederick MacDonagh to preserve part of what was once a substantial medieval Irish homiliary, the work of a single scholar. Even within that collection, however, the Sermo is idiosyncratic, and MacDonagh himself noted that the text was, quote, sui generis, there being no such sermon in any other homiliary, end quote. People who have worked with Atkinson's Passions and Homilies know the weakness of that edition. Notably, Atkinson separated the Latin from the Irish, and in the case of the Sermo, the text that he ended up printing, Irish as the reader's text and Latin as an appendix, ended up being virtually incomprehensible. The project I am describing today began as an edition of the Sermo alone, which, given the odd format of Atkinson's edition, I consider the first critical edition. Yet in Atkinson's mangled printing, the Sermo has been noted here and there as an Irish text on kingship worth considering, and the text's long quotation from the Rex Iniquus was noted by MacDonagh. As for the native justice of the ruler, the idea has been introduced in the Sermo, but with care, even curious caution. The Sermo opens with a reading from Proverbs 16:7, quote, when the ways of a man please the Lord, he will turn his enemies to peace. Typical of the commentary style throughout the text, a statement in Latin, often biblical or patristic, is immediately translated into Irish. Now, from this point, it actually is useful to have an overview of the structure of the Sermo. This description of the structure draws on Frederick MacDonagh's description of the homilies from the Lower Brack. I have modified it to reflect that Sermo has some features that set it apart from the other homilies. There are 2 rousing homiletic closing sections, parts C and D, as here on the slide, but it is the body of the sermon, the expositio, in 3 parts that I look at today. What I call exposition 1 is an introduction to Solomon's kingship, including a quotation and discussion of 1 Kings 3, the same narrative of the 4 grants that we looked at already in the adapted version from the teagasc. That is, Solomon asks for the Lord a grant of an understanding mind. The second part of the exposition is a long discussion of what the phrase from Proverbs, vi hominis, means. That is, what are the ways of man which are pleasing to the Lord. The part I call exposition 3 is the Sermo's quotation and translation from the Rex Iniquus. True to its source, its preoccupation is the king's justice. True to this source, it is this part of the text that most closely resembles the native ideology of Fir Fladalon, or the justice of a ruler. MacDonagh ventured the claim that the Sermo was based on the Rex Iniquus. The text is indeed quoted in the Latin in full with a line-by-line translation into Irish and then with a full complement of commentary. All the same, the quotation and discussion of the Rex Iniquus specifically runs to only 3 columns in the Lower Barak out of a total of 9. I have come to believe that what is important in the Sermo is not the quotation of the Rex Iniquus as such. In context, the Rex Iniquus is overwhelmed by a wealth of biblical learning in the rest of the text. I believe that in effect, the 11th century Sermo has been composed as rejoinder to the Rex Iniquus, a response to and perhaps partial repudiation of the royal ideology put forward in its 8th century source. Be that as it may, in this talk, I am not concerned with subtle revisions to the ideology of the king's justice in the Sermo, so much as I am concerned with the vernacularization of the Sermo that we find in the Tagus. To begin looking at this, I draw your attention to one of the earlier Irish author's sleight of hands, his manipulation of the biblical proverb. Here we go. His manipulation of the biblical proverb on peace to the theme of the king's power. Now, the Sermo established the initial scheme whereby Proverbs, which concerned, quote, the ways of man, could be understood to pertain especially to kings. I'll read the translation here, the second half of the bottom of the slide. Quote, as the royal sage testifies here when he says that when the ways of a man please the Lord, he will turn his enemies to peace. But it is to be observed that although this judgment is fitting for other men, nevertheless it pertains more fittingly to kings. For when the ways of kings please the Lord, then their enemies are turned to peace. We can note that the royal theme is foregrounded by this description of Solomon, who was believed to be the author of Proverbs in the Middle Ages, as Nri Eganith, or the royal sage. In the version of this passage that made it into the Tagus, or rather the revision and abbreviation of this passage, a king's ways are further explained as his gnivra, or his actions. Quote, I'll read the English, for if the acts of worldly kings agree with the Lord, then the Lord will bring their enemies to their will. It is notable here that in the Tagus, a king is referred to as specifically a yidi silta, or a worldly secular king, specifically. This exegetical addition reflects a rhetorical strategy in effect throughout the text as it adapts its source. This is, namely, whereas the earlier text was about kings and God, and the Proverbs still referred to as Quimda or Lord, in the Tagus, the material is shaped around 2 classes of kings of the world down here, and a God who is just as often referred to by the phrase Di Niva, or King of Heaven. This feature is illustrated further here. The Sermo had written, Audi ergo rex preceptum domini adisce vias eis, hear therefore, O king, the command of the Lord, and learn his ways. In the Tagus, this is rendered, Tor of the venvan ri halvanda, forcodags forconga idi niva. Consider then, O earthly king, the teaching and command of the king of heaven, or the heavenly king. Where the Sermo had contrasted king with dominus, or lord, which might suggest at least some kind of hierarchical relationship, in the Tagus, this one king is set beside another. This is to say, rhetorically at any rate, that the difference is not one of kind so much as postal code. The rhetorical sleight of hand in this instance is fairly straightforward. A more striking blurring of the boundary between earthly king and God is found in a passage where the author stresses his principal point, namely that it is the duty of a Christian king to use force in punishment of the wicked. As described in the Sermo and echoing in sentiment Paul, it is a king's duty, quoting this text on the stride right now, quote, to extirpate the godless and parricides from the earth. As it is written, have no mercy on all men who do wicked deeds, Psalm 58:6. The psalm here addresses God, by the way, of course, who is exhorted to punish the wicked throughout the Psalter. In the version of this passage that is adapted into the Tagus, the verse from Psalm 58 is rephrased. O king, do not have compassion on all who practice injustice on all. With this substitution, the author of the Tagus clearly contends that the worldly king's license to use force is the same force which God allows himself. To this point, I have looked at the ways in which the Tagus has emphasized royal authority, both through plain evocations of biblical teaching and through manipulation of the language of the source text. I reiterate my belief that the Tagus was intended for a royal audience. If not explicitly in the title, then certainly it has been crafted linguistically at a layman's reading level and presumably addressing their concerns. With that directness in mind, the text would seem to be an exhortation to kings to act with force, confident in their God-giving authority to do so. As one wonders whether Irish kings at any time may have actually required encouragement to smite their enemies, I turn now to other applications of this royal theory in this text. This is another way of approaching the question specifically what, in the final analysis, happens when a learned text like Sermo ad Reges, biblical commentary addressed to an ecclesiastical elite, is repurposed to a lay audience. I believe that in this question lies part of the answer as to why the Tagus, for all of its roughness, was a comparatively successful text in the Middle Ages. The reason is that the Tagus touched on the relationship between secular power and ecclesiastical authority in a palpable, coherent way by virtue of its direct address to the king, comparatively unhindered by the academic speculations of its immediate source. This application of learning to contemporary needs is illustrated most clearly in the second half of this slide that we looked at just a few moments ago. And now this is the continuation of the passage with the psalm in which the psalm is quoted. Here, the king is exhorted to extirpate the Mek Balatan, or the sons of malediction. Specifically, quote, for the king who punishes the sons of malediction and kills the overly wicked is a worthy disciple of the Lord. These sons of malediction are not in the source text in the Sermo, but they have been inserted 3 times into the Tagus. With this prominence, this new element in the text constitutes a major theme. I think it is certain that the ultimate origin of the phrase is 2 Peter 2:14. 2 Peter 2, yes, here, where Peter warns of corruption that will be spread from within the church itself. Quote, but there were also false prophets among the people, even as there shall be among you lying teachers, magistri mendaces, having eyes full of adultery and of sin that ceaseth not, alluring unstable souls, having their heart exercised with covetousness, sons or children of malediction, maledictionis filii, end quote. The whole of 2 Peter is a tour de force of vicious invective. One can wonder whether the Mek Balatan, or the sons of malediction of the Irish text, is a phrase just borrowed willy-nilly, simply for the love of insult, or perhaps at some remove. Clarification of what sons of malediction meant in an Irish context can be inferred from working backwards from another passage in the Tagus, transcribed here. This is the centerpiece of the Tagus, in which the king is exhorted not to consort with bregeri, liars, in the church. The passage is long enough. It begins, I'll read the translation. Quote, for a harsh recognition is demanded for the liars, bregeri, who lead the people astray and who bring them into kinds of perverted faith, which is hostile to God and to the universal Christian church, and who sing their worship and their prayers at the top of their voices, loudly in the presence of the throngs and the multitudes, who like to be hailed and honored by people, and they atop their chariots and horses. For the Lord wants from every king who joins with that people that he be in the depths of the eternal kingdom, together with the liars in the condemnation of the judge of doomsday. I am confident that the language of bregeri, liars, here recalls Peter's magistri mendaces, or lying teachers of the ancient church. The Irish author borrows the language of Peter to condemn a practice which he presumably saw in the church of his day. Beyond that, I'm not entirely certain what is described here. The language recalls more generally Jesus in Mark 12, where he warns the people, quote, beware of the scribes who love to go in long clothing and love salutations in marketplaces and the chief seats in the synagogues and the uppermost rooms at feasts, which for a pretense make long prayers. They shall receive greater condemnation or damnation. But while there is a hint of anti-clericalism, the key is surely the insinuation that kings are too close to these people. Recall that this passage on the liars is unique to the Tagus and is not drawn from the source text, the Sermo. We can get closer to the meaning of the passage if we look at what it replaced. Okay. Now, in the place of the diatribe against the bregeri, or the liars, the earlier Sermo had this warning to the king not to permit sinners to live in his kingdom. Omnes namque quoscunque peccatores sub se in praesenti habuit super se modo plagalli in illa futura pena habebit. For all the sinners whom the king had beneath him in the present world, he will have over him as an affliction in that punishment to come. The author of the Tagus has not retained this passage, but I believe he's riffed on it, so to speak, in his rant on the liars. Specifically, the author of the Tagus picked up on the theme of the peccatores, sinners here, and the coming punishment, and both these brought to his mind the opening of the classic Middle Irish apocalyptic text, Fish Adabnon, or the Vision of Adabnon. The Vision of Adabnon here first quotes a psalm in the Latin, then comments in Irish. I'll read the translation, quote, "The Lord then raises up the meek, but casts sinners, peccatores, down to the earth." And then in the Irish, "The Lord then raises up to himself in heaven those who are loving, but he assails and overthrows, casting them down to earth and hell, the unprofitable assembly of the sons of malediction." With this sequence of peccatores, sinners, from the Sermo, and the peccatores, or children of malediction, from the Vision of Adabnon, the author of the Tagus found a ready provided link between the content of the Sermo, which he was rewriting, and the teaching of 2 Peter, which he obviously felt was going to be central to his own text. It seems inescapable that the Mech Valachton, children of malediction, in the Tagus were the lying teachers from 2 Peter who had infiltrated Christ's church. While it is still not clear to me exactly who the liars in question in the Tagus were, specifically Irish ones, the original audience would certainly have recognized that their punishment in the next life had already been described, again, in the Vision of Adabnon. Here are the liars in the next world, and here is the company they keep. Note the phrases in bold, the ois groiv, tarum dechadorin rad in the breged. I will read the translation because it would be a little easier. Yeah. Quote, "There is another company there." Remember, this is Vision of Adabnon describing hell, wearing red fiery chasubles. "By turns, they are caught up to the firmament and then dashed down into the depths of hell. Infants and boys are at all times wounding and slashing them from every side. Those who are in that torment are priests who have violated their vows, and those whose faith is cold, and liars who mislead and deceive the multitudes and take it upon themselves to perform for them feats and miracles which they cannot accomplish." Now, here are the notable textual correspondences between the Tagus and the Vision of Adabnon in this passage. It might be argued that these echoes of the Vision of Adabnon are not borrowings from that text, but simply formulaic, homiletic language. I argue that the rhetoric they share from 2 Peter indicates that they are thematically related as well, and that the liars of the first text are the same class as the liars of the second. From the incidents in the Vision of Adabnon, one can infer only that these men have something to do with leading or teaching the people. One might infer religious charlatans or faith healers, but I do not know what might have been meant in the context of the medieval church, the Irish church of this period. At the very least, from the Tagus, we get that these liars were understood to hold prominent positions in the church. But what I regard the important point of their mention in the Tagus is that they had a status high enough to be close to the king. Indeed, there are hints that this class of liars criticized in the Tagus are not itinerants or palace conspirators, but prominent holders of office in the Irish church. With the mention that these liars can be seen from the heights of their chariots, one can even wonder whether bishops are meant. The Tagus shares with the Sermo a section where there is an extensive quotation of Paul's defense of king's authority to use the sword from Romans. I have not quoted that here. To this section, however, this long discussion of Paul, let's see, the Tagus has added this short digression on the other person, apart from God, a king answers to. Not only God, but his anankara, soul friend, or confessor. Here's the passage here, with the anankara Dagnith. I'll read from my translation. Let's see, quote, "If, however, it is the king who commits an illegal act, or is a tyrant, he is guilty before no one else but the King of heaven and earth, and before his wise Anamkara, soul friend, whom God appointed to his side to preach the word of God to him. For the prophet Ezekiel says that 2/3 of the king's guilt is to go to his Anamkara, who works his instruction not through alliance and through flattery, I guess, for governing his kingdom and his reign in accordance with God's law, and the other third to the king if it is unknowingly that he acts." I mentioned that this is a work in progress. I have not yet identified where this particular bit about payment to an Anamkara comes from. It is obvious enough that it is a quotation from Irish law, maybe a monastic text. The point is clear enough, however, that the king's confessor is remunerated for his services from the king's resources. This passage on the king's confessor encourages us to see some professional competition in the author's condemnation of the sons of malediction. These do not only presumably represent perverse teaching and custom, they also apparently represent competition for royal resources. With this digression into the status of the king's anum cara, the Tagus muddies its hands with the real world. Its source text, the Sermo ad Reges, was a much more pure piece of biblical exegesis. In my mind, an intellectual exercise that was never actually intended for royal ears. The Tagus incorporates the biblical learning of the earlier text, but its exegetical arguments have been hijacked by the practical question of church and king here on earth. And above all, the question of the relationship of the clergy to power. We recall the language and the themes borrowed from the vision of Adamnon, where indeed there is a special place in hell for priests who lie. So do we infer that the Tagus is anti-clerical? I infer the opposite. The central theme of the Sermo was that it was a king's duty to punish evildoers, a God-decreed monopoly on the use of force. I happen to find no prescription in the Tagus for the king to actually punish the liars described. Marie-Therese Flanagan noted that royal heavy-handedness was in fact a matter of concern during the reform movement of the 11th and 12th centuries, the reform of the Irish Church. The bloodthirsty doctrine of the Sermo, in this regard, itself based on the 7th century tract of the Rex Iniquus, indeed feels a bit like a voice from a different age. In the Rex Iniquus, the just king with the sword of the zealot in his hand was very nearly as scary as the unjust king, arguably scarier. We can see, but this voice, the scary voice, though present in the Tagus, has been softened. We can see on this slide what is closer to the heart of the practical author of the Tagus, that is effectively a reminder of a contract. What do we have here? No. We can infer that the author was himself a churchman. I see no questions of doctrine in this text, in the Tagus, nor of pastoral care as such. The discussion of kingly power, nearly royal absolutism, is, however, I am sure, sincere. We can note the subtlety of the argument in the sly alteration brought even to the verse from Proverb 16, on which the tract ultimately is based. The proverb had said, cum placuerent domino viae hominis inimico seus convertet ad pacem, for when the ways of man please the Lord, he will turn his enemies to peace. The Irish of the Tagus rephrases this, second half of the slide. For if the acts of worldly kings agree with the Lord, then the Lord will bring their enemies to their will. Apart from this endorsement of, so there's no peace, there's only will. Apart from the endorsement for royal power as such, the discussion of biblical kingship in this text is a vehicle to remind the king of his obligations to the church. At least this is what I propose. This is how I understand it. This reminder is explicit in one last passage unique to the Tagus, and the last I will discuss today. Following the admonition that the king should not make party with the sons of malediction and their haughty ways, the author continues, quote, I'll read the English. For it is required from the king, that he give proper recognition to the learned men who preach the word of God and to the people and to the church. For it is by that teaching that every single believing person is born on the truthful, perfect way which reaches to the household of heaven. The king's job is not to be above clergy. Quite the contrary, the clergy, the good ones, are the king's instructors, his confessors, and as suggested here, mandated recipients of his favors. Now, I think I've spoken a little too long, so I'm going to rush to a close. If the Rex Iniquus was about the principle, namely the justice of the ruler, and if the Sermo ad Reges was about an institution, namely kingship, the Tagus Riga, if not exactly unprincipled, is mostly about institutions, and two of them, kingship and the church. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Brent. That was wonderful. Let's give a round of applause. Unfortunately silent, to our speaker, Professor Brent Miles. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions. I'm just moving my screen so that I can see them. Oh, there we go. Okay.
It may not be.
Wonderful. So thank you very much for that. That was really, really interesting.